We're going to talk about the 4 key elements of systematic ELD today. Systematic ELD is really just the idea that we can't leave learning English to chance and that we have to follow a system of how we teach and deliver the instruction of English to English learners. And it starts really with the focus on vocabulary, and then we're going to look at the functions. We're going to follow that with language structure, and then we're going to have a chance to practice that. This is, and obviously you're familiar with this, this is D3, and we're only going to hone in on this part today. So I think that this really is the targeted instruction, and the first part that we're going to look at is focusing on that language objective, and just on these elements. All right, so we're going to look at fluency. And what this is really, fluency is really important. When we're asking students to read academic text, we're asking them to look at academic discourse. And so the reading comprehension part is one component, but then we're also asking them to participate in a conversation, an academic conversation. And students do not come to school necessarily readily prepared to have an academic conversation. So like anything else, we have to teach them those skills so that when they are asked to perform a task, an academic task, they can ask and answer questions, describe, compare and contrast. For just a few examples of what we want them to do, we need to teach them the language on how to do that. All right, so the first part that we're going to look at is vocabulary. And there's a really clear distinction between content vocabulary and academic vocabulary. The content vocabulary, or the examples right here, is called The 3 Tiers of Vocabulary by Kate Kinsella. And on the right, we're looking at those Tier 3 vocabulary words. Those are the content vocabulary words that we often see in textbooks. They're sometimes highlighted. They're the ones we usually have students make flashcards for and study them. But they're really only useful for that one moment in time, that one chapter, that one lesson. They're not as transferable. We don't often hear isotope in another setting. It's pretty specific to that science lesson. So their frequency of use is pretty specific, and it oftentimes is only used when we call on a child to use it in that one content area. Looking at Tier 2, and that's an example of what that content vocabulary looks like in the textbooks. And we're lucky because the new textbooks do a really good job of highlighting all the content vocabulary for students. So they make it more interesting, and they usually have the definitions really close for students to quickly access. So that's a good thing. But then we really have to spend a lot of our time teaching those Tier 2 vocabulary words. If you think about it, a Tier 2 word, if I teach a child a Tier 2 word, they're going to have multiple opportunities to use and see that word among various different content areas. They may see the word sum in math, and they may see the word summative in a language assessment. So we want them to find those words. We want to help teach them with specific intent of teaching just that one word and really getting it to mastery so that when they see it in other content areas, then they can go in and they can actually recall that information, use it, and break down that more challenging text, and then use it in academic discourse when they're asking and answering questions. So that's a good strategy for English learners. And here are just a few more keys. How do you decide if a word is a Tier 2 vocabulary word or a Tier 3? And the real test is there a reason why a student would need this word in another content area, or will they see it somewhere else? Does it have a high utility? Is it a word that when I learn that, I hate, it's kind of a term, but like the most bang for your buck? Like, is that a word you're gonna encounter multiple times? And if so, that's a word we really need to specifically teach, call out, and students need to learn to mastery. And also, sometimes there are those words like the function words of what we're asking them to do, or the assessment words sometimes that students see when they're being asked to answer questions maybe on the STAR test or on a summative test that they struggle with. So sometimes they miss the question simply because they didn't understand the words that were in the question. So calling special attention to those and making an extra effort to teach those, oftentimes maybe front-loading it before you start the lesson so they have a better likelihood of being able to master the content standard. All right, and here are some other examples. Assessment words, function words, and discourse connectors. And discourse connectors can also be called signal words. They're the words that's in a text that often signals the reader that there's a purpose why the author is writing this. So for example, if you're reading a story and the author is trying to compare and contrast something, they may use a word like while or but or in contrast. And those words signal that reader to go, hey, what's the author's purpose for writing this? And if we teach those words, we can help them with the comprehension, but we can also help them with the language, because then when they're asked to do that task, to make the Venn diagram and to compare two things, they will have that language to be able to produce it to make that happen in their conversations and when they're answering questions for teachers, and also understanding it when talking about it with another student. All right, so this is the specific language objective, and in the blue you will see that the purpose of the language function is it's the purpose of the lesson, and it's the what we want them to do. It's the verb. Most often the function is the verb, it's the action. Sometimes you find them in a content standard, sometimes you find them in an instructional objective, but it's the verb. It's what we want the student to be able to do. All right. It is also the purpose of what drives us for the task and drives the purpose of the lesson. If we're asking them to describe or to identify the cause and effect or to identify the problem and solution, those are all examples of functions that students will use. And there we go. So the language function, this is sort of a tricky area. Have you ever heard of a student who gets kind of stuck at the level 3 on the CELT test, and we find that we have lots of students who are in that intermediate level? A lot of times that's related to the BICS, that their social language on the playground and in the classroom, the basic language, the who, what, where, when, why, and that asking and answering very low-level questions is very common. But what happens is when we move them into the CALPS, when we get to about 3rd grade, and suddenly the demand, we're no longer learning to read, but we're reading to learn. When we get to that part, those are those words that oftentimes students get confused, and they stall out at that level 3, that intermediate level, around grades 3 and 4. And that's because all of a sudden the task becomes harder and the language function becomes more challenging. And so in order to better prepare students, we need to directly instruct them on what those functions are, what the academic vocabulary is, and all the grammatical structures, so that they will be able to do what's being asked of them when reading a story or analyzing a problem or researching history. They need to be able to do that in content area, along with not just English language arts, but in the other content areas as well. And how many of you are familiar with the planning matrix? Okay, so the green, it's usually green on the paper, on the left-hand side, which I like because the function on your paper is green, and that means go. Like if we got to a stoplight, we're in green, it means go. It's the first thing we want them to look at. What is the function? Before we go, we need to know what the function is that we're asking the student to do. So that's in green, and we're going to be focusing on that function and identifying it in the lesson. Once we've identified our function, then we can look across at the word structures that they need, the academic vocabulary, and the sentence frames, the oral language practice. And here are some examples of them. And a great question that came up when I was teaching the class was, are these in order from low-level complexity to higher? And the answer is not necessarily. The content will drive the complexity of a function. You could have identify and think that's a really low level, identify the subject in the sentence. However, if you were asking somebody to identify the cause and effect, then that would be a much more challenging use of the function. So it just depends on what you're teaching, your grade level, and the content standard that you're looking at. All right. Now we're going to talk about the language structure, and there's 3 parts to the language structure. And we're going to look at the vocabulary, the usage, and the sentence frame or the sentence structure. All right, this is also known as the expressive task. And it's really focusing on, this is the part. Oftentimes students know what the function is, and they're able to say they know what that word means of what we're asking them to do. But when we're asking them what is the language associated with that task, what is the word structure that we're looking for, that's when it becomes more complex and challenging for students. Some of the word structures of breaking down words is looking at the prefixes, the suffixes, and the roots. It's always a good idea to directly teach students those parts that are related. If you have a content area where you have certain prefixes and suffixes that show up more in that one content area, that's a good strategy. Cognates are always great. They help students link if they're a second language learner. It helps them link it to their primary language. But these 2 alone are not enough to do the job of teaching students the grammar, the grammatical structure, the vocabulary, and the sentence frame they'll need to be able to produce the language we want them to show proficiency at the function and at that content objective. All right, so here's a sentence frame that sort of helps you, that looks at identifying what the function is. and then using each of the 3 expressive tasks. First, there's the academic vocabulary. Second is the sentence frame or frames, depending on how you, what level you teach and what your different varying SELT levels are in your class. And thirdly, it's the word structures, the grammar, the word analysis, and the cognates that we're looking at. All right. So here is an example of the objective is students will classify solids, liquids, gases using. And on that first example, those are the academic vocabulary words associated with this. And again, the function here is to classify. And then those are the academic words. And then the second one would be examples of sentence frames. And the third one would be the grammar that is needed, parallel structures with adjectives and nouns that would align with that objective. This is the hard, probably the challenging part. In the very beginning of learning how to write language objectives and sentence frames, we often tend to go to the easier side of the sentence frame. And that's perfectly natural. When we start writing them, we kind of go with the simple frame. But what we need to remember is that in order to move a student from a SELT level 3 to a SELT 4 or a SELT 5 and to eventually hopefully be able to redesignate them, we also need to front load the academic vocabulary they'll need to move to that more advanced sentence frame. And then we also have to expect that of them and be pushing them through to the next frame. So it isn't a one-size-fits-all. Sometimes in your classroom, you have to find a way to meet many different SELT levels in the classroom at one time. They don't all come in level 3 all grouped in your class. So you may have every level, every different SELT level in your class. So how could you differentiate that in the classroom to make sure that the student is getting an opportunity to practice the sentence frame that's at their appropriate level? So when you're writing your language objective today, you want to make sure that if you identified your class as a SELT level 3, that your frames match that. Or if you selected that everybody in your class had a SELT level 5, you would expect that the frame that you're going to select for your D3 on D3 would align with what would be expected of somebody who is a SELT level 5. It would be a more advanced frame, like that example right there. If blank hadn't blank, they wouldn't have blank. The language complexity and the lexile level there is much higher, and the language demand is higher than it would be of they blank, they blank. So as long as it's okay to start with the easier frame, so long as we're not forgetting to push them to the next frame. Sometimes you have to start with the easier one to front load what you're asking them to do before you get to the higher one, even for your level 3s. It's okay to start a level back, practice to proficiency, and then challenge them to that next level. All right, so here is an example. And for Anna and Eric, I picked this one for you because it's PE, and it's always very hard to find a PE example. First of all, PE is challenging because most of your standards start with a verb, jump, run, and those aren't exactly language functions. So we searched for some that started with a language function, and the one that we came up with was explain the benefits of stretching after warm-up activities. So once we identified our content standard, we had to look and think, well, what is the function? What are we asking the students to do? What is the language function? So we can't just run with the verb. We had to find the language function. And that function was to explain. So that was the first thing we did, was identify the function. Yes, and then we have our chart over here. And this is sort of a step-by-step of how you identify, when you're starting to write a language objective, this is really step 1. Identify the content standard. That will drive deciding what your function is going to be. So the first thing you do is identify the content standard. The second thing you need to do is then, if necessary, you need to withdraw what your instructional objective will be. If your standard is really elaborate, you may want to single out one idea or one component to focus on for your lesson. And then that is the next step. You will then look for your language function. And oftentimes the verb is right there in your instructional objective, but if it's not, you may have to figure out, using the planning matrix, you may have to look for one that aligns with that. If it isn't directly in there, you may have to go into the the planning matrix and look for a function that aligns with your lesson. Then once you've done that, we can then talk about what it is that we want the students to be able to say, or what we want the students to be able to write. This is your expressive task. So remember, the receptive is the listening, and the expressive is the talking, the output of language. So what do we want them to be able to say, or what do we want them to be able to write? So if you're an 11th grade teacher, you may be focusing more on the writing task, and maybe starting with a language task like an oral practice and then advancing them into more writing. But if you're in the middle grades, you may be starting with the expressive and then moving them into the writing. First, they need to be able to talk about what they think, and then they will be able to write what they think. So the first step is to list all the academic vocabulary students will use to express the language function. The next thing you'll do is write the sentence frame. Sometimes a really good trick for doing that is actually writing out what you want your students to be able to say, and then breaking it down from there to identify what the grammatical structure would be. Once you have that, then you can look and go, what is the grammar that I used in my sentence? And what am I asking them, the students, to do? And the last one that we look at is that grammar is tough. You have some resources in there we're going to use today to help you with identifying that grammatical structure, and that we want you to know that there are some that are aligned specifically to functions. It doesn't mean that it's limited to that. You can go outside of that, but if you aren't sure what they are, we provided you an additional resource to look for some that will align with your function. All right. So first step is to identify the academic language. And then how will students express orally and writing their understanding of the content and language objective? What will it look like? If a student, its response is to mastery, what will that look like? And then what word structure will the students need to use in order to produce that language? And now in your packet you have this page. As I said, when we wrote this, we did pick a PE standard because that is a challenging area, and there are many others when you get into certain types of subjects where it does become a little bit, it's not quite as easy as an English language arts standard. So we tried to pick one that was a little bit more challenging. And in doing so, the great part about that is it helps you work through the process of how to write the language objective. And you start with some of the words that we would practice, such as benefit, less likely, another, were academic words that we decided would be helpful when we were asking a student to be able to explain the benefits of stretching after warm-up activities using declarative sentences. So first I would want to teach the academic vocabulary. Then I have the sentence frame written out there, blank of blank is blank. But I also would have to make sure that they know what a declarative sentence is. So I might be teaching, there's no magical order to teaching a language objective. Some days you might have to front load the vocabulary and the grammatical structure and then practice the frame. But when you do your planning, you want to make sure you know what all three are before you start teaching it, so that you know what's coming up, so you can make sure that the students are getting front loaded with everything they'll need to do to be able to perform that task. And so we talked about it. And I need to get my sample. I didn't write that on there. No, it's okay, I can fix it. So what are some of the benefits of warming and stretching up is that it's better to stretch when your muscles are warm because you're less likely to become injured. So, for example, a sentence frame might be the benefit of stretching before exercise is your muscles are less likely to become injured. And so that would be an acceptable response from a student for that one. Now we're going to look at the second one. Okay. So we've given you a 4th grade standard at the top. And the standard is students will be able to strike a gently tossed ball with a bat using side orientation. So that's the content standard. And from that, we withdrew the instructional objective. So we're back here again to this kind of flow chart to help you. Starting with the content, then we went to the instructional objective. Students will be able to describe orally how to strike a gently tossed ball with a bat using a side orientation. So the first thing we're going to ask you to do is try to practice this on your own and try and identify what the function is in this lesson. So let's just start with that first. So we'll break it down. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the function. So down at the very bottom, there's the 3 parts of the expressive task. We're first going to look at the academic language, then we're going to work on a sentence frame, and then we're going to work on identifying what the appropriate word structure is that we would want to teach students in order to be able to answer and to basically to use the sentence frame and to understand what the word structure is needed, what word structure is needed when we're asking them to describe. So down at the bottom, you will see that there is right there what we're going to be asking the students to do. So we're sort of going to work backwards. And we're going to ask you to read through this and try and identify what the academic language is that's being used, because this is the student response of what we would want the student to say. So we're going to work backwards, and we're going to identify what the academic language is what the sentence frame might be, what it would look like, and what the word structure is. So we're going to work on that independently right now, and then we're going to come back together and we're going to discuss it and talk about it, because there is no one right answer to this. There's not a specific answer key where we have just one choice. There's many embedded within here, and there's no we're not looking for one specific answer. So try and write down whatever you think that it is, and we'll practice it, and then we'll come back together and we'll talk about it as a group.